All right, welcome to week 4 on our Introduction to Ghost Studies series. We will be talking today about pseudoscience, skepticism, and altered states of consciousness. All right, so this week, we'll be presenting with a healthy dose of skepticism and the possibility, in many cases, that the probability that ghostly experiences is not real. So the possibility, or if you would like, the probability that most ghostly encounters are not real. We will look at giving each event the proper amount of rigorous analyses to rule out any physical causes. We will also look at what these causes are internally and externally. So we're going to look at what that means for these causes to be internal and external, and also provide skepticism of the skepticism of materialism. So we're going to be skeptical about skepticism itself. Okay, so first we have to address hallucinations. What's a hallucination? Well, a hallucination, here's your eyeball and you see something. You see something that, like a ghost or whatever, it's not there. You think it's there, but it's not there. That would be an hallucination. I'm sure many of you are familiar with hallucinations, particularly if you're talking about hallucinogenic drugs like acid or peyote or DMT, any of those things. They make you see things that aren't really there, although some people argue that they actually are there and that our normal sensual and perceptual faculties aren't able to see them. But nevertheless, it makes us see things that aren't normally there, or that wouldn't be there from a materialist paradigm. So we see things that aren't there. Some are accidental, and some are normative. Here's the difference. Accidental. Okay, what's the difference between accidental and normative? Accidental is when you see something that just is not there, but as sometimes you look at it and it is there, or it's different than what you think it is. Okay, let's say you're walking in the desert. I don't know if many of you have walked in the desert, and there's sand everywhere, fucking sand, and you see what looks like a pond or a lake or a puddle of water. And what that is, it's the way that the heat from the sand emanates, and it gives the impression that there's actually water there. It looks like it's rippling, right? But it's all it is just the heat emanating from the sand, and it makes it look like there's water when there isn't. That would be an accidental. Hallucination. That's something that doesn't normally. You don't normally see things that way, because as soon as you walk up on it, you see that it's just sand. But from a specific distance, it looks like water. Another example. Well, I was going to give you another example, but I don't think so. That would be one of many examples. You see what looks like water in the desert. You look around the corner and you see the shade of what looks like a body, and then you just walk a little closer and you're like, okay, it's not there. So that would be an accidental hallucination. Now there are some bleed over from accidental to normative. We'll talk about that. So a normative hallucination is just the way our faculties or perceptual faculties just normally function. For example, our view of depth perception. So you're here. Let's say you're in a boat, Terrible boats. And there's an oar in the water, plunges in the water. Now, when the oar is in the water, it looks bent. And that's because the way the light is hitting the water literally bends the light. So to the eyes, it looks bent, when in reality, it's actually straight. So that is a normative hallucination. It's seeing something that isn't really there, which is a bent ore. The ore is there, but the fact that it's bent is not a state of a state of things, or the state in which that ore is normally functioning. So that would be a normative hallucination. Another normative hallucination would be just the ID color. You see, a red car. Yeah, it's a red car driving by. Okay, you see the color red. Actually, what you see is the wavelengths. The wavelength due to what the absorption of certain wavelengths while permitting other wavelengths to pass through. So the wavelength that we see that would normally be perceived in our brains as red is actually just what's absorbed in the paint that's used, or the material that's used, and the other wavelengths are actually just passed through or reflected off, and we don't see them. But we see the wavelengths that are absorbed in that, and the wavelengths that are absorbed is red. So in a way, that's a normative hallucination, because we're seeing something that, although it is there, but it's a wavelength. It's not actually a quality. The quality of red is not something we see. We should just see vibrations, but we see colors. So you actually should see these wavelengths, but we see this quality called color. So that, in a sense, is a hallucination. It's a normative one. It's just the way we see reality. It's just the way we see it. But nevertheless, it is normative. It's how we always see things. But the most relevant hallucination, normatively, are those related to systems of self and progeny preservation. So self-prodigy and preservation. I'll give you a couple examples of that. Okay, self-progeny and preservation are instincts, nay, the very basis for how we develop. According to natural selection, not just the strong survive, only the well-adapted survive. So let's say you're, an early hominid. You're in the Serengeti, or something like that, or some sort of forest area or whatever. As such, our brains and what they perceive aren't always interested in understanding what's true and what's real. Only what gets our bodies in positions to survive. So the brain is not really interested in telling us, here's a lion or whatever. It's not interested in telling us what's true about the lion. It's interested in telling us what we need to know about our environment to get our bodies moving so we don't become its prey. So whatever gets our bodies moving is what is going to be what's going to be on our minds, because we have developed over a series of time in order to develop these instincts so that we can survive. Consider the phenomenon of pareidolia. It's an interesting word. Pareidolia is a condition or psychological phenomenon where we assign human characteristics to non-human characteristics. For example, you're in the jungle or the Serengeti, and there's bushes around us, right? Well, you see what looks like a face. And you see it really quick. You see it in the bushes. Well, it's not. It's just the arrangement of the leaves. But we, as a species, have developed a system of alertness. And whenever we see something that may even look like a predator, guess what? We run away. So we think it is a face when it's really not a face. So that's a hallucination. And it's good that we do that, because we don't have time to sit there and rationalize. You're not going to sit there and, for instance, imagine you're standing in the African jungle and look in the bushes, and if a leopard or a lion or leopard's hiding, you haven't the time to reason as to whether it is or isn't a lion or a leopard. You're not going to sit there and go, let's see, I see the tail, I see the bushiness is moving in a particular way. Okay, it must be a lion. Or looks like the shape of the face is made up of leaves. So I think it's just an image that looks like a lion. So I'm just going to be okay. So pareidolia is something in our brains that allows us to see things before we're able to reason about them, before we go through the process of logically deducing whether that thing is what it is, which is a good thing because that way we are alerted and we run away. Unfortunately, it could be a bad thing when we're trying to assign or we're trying to understand things like ghosts, because obviously if you think you see a face in a dark hallway and you say, oh no, it's a ghost, you're wrong. It wasn't a ghost at all. It was just your pareidolia, that activity of your brain assigning human characteristics to things that aren't there. See, our faculties develop to ensure we see faces and bodies whether they are there or not. It's the fight or flight. In this instance, perhaps the fright. In short, we are programmed to see faces and human images in places we can't make out, things we can't understand. That goes along with ghosts. We can't make out what's going on, but we just assign human characteristics to those things we're seeing. Hence, if we think we see a body in the distance, let's say, or Jesus is faced on toast, right? You see that a lot. Like what this is an example of pareidolia, and we're also programmed to hear voices too. So it's not just pareidolia, but there's also the phenomenon of hearing a voice. So you're sitting here, and you hear a voice in the distance, and it's one of your buddies, one of your friends from your tribe screaming, "I need help!" Well, you don't really have time if it's a distant cry, if it's gurgled, or if it's they're in extreme trauma or whatever. They don't have time to voice it. So it's best that you're able to hear, you're able to react without thinking, sounded like they said help, I'm not sure. So instead of you reasoning, your cognitive faculties will inspire you to run to that location to help them, whether there's somebody there or there isn't somebody there. It was just the wind howling. Well, that's another example of how ghost hunters will they take EVPs and things like that of sounds, and they will interpret these sounds. Oh, didn't you hear that voice? Well, that comes to our brains. That comes to our cognitive faculties that have evolved in order for us to hear human voices where they're not human voices, because it's much quicker and much more expedient to react to something we thought was a voice, in a split second. So you come for help and respond, just like a child. A child is expected to hear something that sounds like a human, and likewise. So we've developed these in order to survive, but the downside is it inspires us to come up with some really conclusions about what we're experiencing, and oftentimes it just demonstrates that we're experiencing things that aren't really there. Cold spots and warm spots, like the constant ebbing and flowing of the ocean. You got the sun's beating down, and this turns warm, and this right here is the cold. It's not exposed, so it moves up, gets heated, goes down, moves up, goes down. So it's this constant ebb and flow of temperatures. Well, that's no different than if you're walking in a room. I mean, if you're walking in a room, you have all the air molecules around. Some are hot, some are cold. Some come down, some go up. It's very possible you might have a cold spot. Doesn't mean that there's a ghost there that's absorbing energy from that specific location. And likewise, there might be a warm spot. Doesn't mean that this is the emission of an energy field or some sort of energy source that would be, the disembodied soul of a human. It just means that because temperatures are constantly fluctuating, you have a spot, just like you do when you're in the ocean and you feel a cold or warm spot. So it's no different. In short, there are reasons due to our altered states, and these are altered states of consciousness. These are us being conscious of something that is just simply not there. We're not having a normal relationship with reality. We're having an altered relationship, an altered state of consciousness from prey. So it's these help us, prey or even predator, hallucinate, as well as anomalies in sight, sound, and feeling. So these are also anomalies. These are things that aren't normally there in how we see, how we hear, and how we feel, as well as causal events too. You might have something sitting on a shelf, a ball, and some wind blows, and it knocks down the shelf, and it goes like that. And we might assign human agency to this falling when in reality there was a random breeze that pushed it off, or the settling of a house that could cause some sort of change in the balance of a plane, and it could cause it to fall. So there's all sorts of things that happen, not just things that we are that we hear, or we take, or we feel, or we touch, but also things that we reason based on just causal. It's not like there's a ghost necessarily pushing this. It's just that it has another explanation that we just need to dig deeper. And of course, that goes back to the way our minds have developed. If we hear a rustling in the bushes or something like that, and we assume that it's a predator, so we assign some sort of agency to that, some sort of not necessarily human agency, but some sort of animal or some sort of animalistic agency to it. When in reality it's not just the wind, but it's good to have that sort of instinct, so that if you hear that, you take off, because it could be a lion or some sort of thing. So if this, let's see, a brief note on our cognitive perceptual faculties. And some neuroscientists find we create an entire universe in our brains, as mentioned earlier by Donald Hoffman. So this is our mind, and this is everything in our mind. And everything in our mind is supposedly representative of that. The problem is we can't get outside of our mind to compare this and this. We can't do that. All we have is this. All we have is what's inside of our mind. So the point is how are we going to even compare or even determine whether this is an accurate representation of that? We can't. So the problem with some forms of skepticism, and like I said, it's always good to have a healthy dose of skepticism. The problem is that it kind of pulls the rug out from underneath its own worldview. So what can be said of the external world? Are all hallucinations perception? Or all perceptions just hallucination? If the external world is as it is inaccessible, then what can be said of it? What can you say about this outside of this? Ultimately you can't. And we're going to get in a little bit briefly into how that developed. One who found this problem in the late 18th and early 19th century was a guy named Johann Fichte. He was a contemporary of a philosopher you may have heard of, Immanuel Kant. He was a very famous philosopher. And he made this distinction that Fichte questioned. Now, how can you even say there's an external world, a noumenal world? So Kant, Immanuel Kant, said you have two worlds. You have the internal or the phenomenal, what we see, what we experience, and we have the external or the noumenal, the noumenon. Now, what Fichte had suggested is, how do you even know this exists? Because even to say that exists, to even say, well, it is out there, you have to have some knowledge from here of it. But there's no way to access that, even by reason. Because even by reason, you're assuming that this exists out here, and you have to have some evidence that this exists outside of this. But there's no way to access that, to even have a rational conclusion that there is an external world. So he merely ignored this problem, since to bring it up is to admit knowledge of the external. Kant did. So what is better to state? All experiences are reality or real, and one must contextualize, therefore. So what Fichte was saying is that we can't say anything about the external world. So what we have to do is we have to contextualize everything in this. All right? We have to contextualize this. So if, for example, I think I see a ghost, right? Is it normatively that way? Why would I see a ghost? Can I exclude all other possibilities? Well, instead of assuming that there's an external world and the ghosts come from the internal world, what Fichte would have argued would be that all of our experiences from the internal, from inside of us, or as he would say, the he was a proponent of idealism. It came from, in the mind or mind in general. If it came from mind in general, there's no external world, then a ghost would have to be, a ghost or some sort of, experience would have to be related to everything contextually that we already know. So contextually, all we know, is, as we were stating earlier, is that we assign human agency to things that don't have human agency. So we have to look at that and go, was that just the way my mind interprets things, or is it something more? So if it's sustained, if it's continually happening, there might be something to it. If it's just accidental, then we have to look at it and go, well, that can easily be explained by, pareidolia, by, our instincts that have developed that way and this and that. But if it's a sustained, if other people are experiencing the same things, if it's objective, it's not just from my mind, but it's from other minds. All minds are having the same experience. If they're all having the same experience, then there might be something to it. So that's what I meant when I said that we were going to be kind of skeptical about the skepticism. So we should never assume as experience as it appears, but we should embrace a broader view than materialism, which makes the internal-external distinction, which is impossible. So anytime you make the internal and external distinction, it's impossible to even make that distinction. It's a false dichotomy, so to speak. So let us be cautious of the evidence of paranormal investigation while being open to the landscape of reality. So reality could be a lot stranger than we assume. It may not be made up of all material. It may be made up of ideas, as idealism suggests. I'm not saying I'm not a proponent. I kind of am a proponent of idealism, but I'm not arguing for idealism here, because materialism could be just as true. It could be more true, and I could argue why it's more true than idealism. But the point is all we have is our minds, and to make a distinction between what's in our minds and what's outside of our minds, even from a materialistic perspective or idealistic perspective, is not one that we can do. It's a quantum leap. So we should be cautious of many of the claims of paranormal investigators. We should understand how our instincts shape our perceptual faculties, but we should also recognize that that there, as Hamlet said in the great play, what was it? There are more things, Horatio, on earth and heaven that can be dreamt of in your philosophy. So we should be open. We should be open, but we should not but we should be cautious of pseudoscience and things that don't reflect true rational logical thinking. So that ends our discussion today, this week, on pseudoscience and altered states of consciousness. Next week, which will be week 5, we'll be talking about spiritualism and folk theories of ghosts. So join us then, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.